And so we begin by acknowledging that UBC, this Vancouver campus, is located on the traditional, ancestral, and the occupied territory of the Hangkamium-speaking Musqueam peoples. And today we're challenged to think about the relationship of migration and colonialism within the European context. But we know that in this very context that we who are here in person are, it's also a context where migration and colonization have always been intertwined and continue to be so in very complicated ways. In fact, I actually just recently learned that in the early 20th century, the immigration department here was officially called the Department of Immigration and Colonization. So there you go. Doesn't get any more explicit than that. So those of us who are here and who are not from this land, who are not indigenous to these lands, we recognize that we're here as guests of the Musqueam people, and that it's our accountability to the Musqueam people and to the land that we hold and try to, hold present as we go through our day and think about ways in which what our role is in terms of decolonizing. I know that's a big word. Those of you who don't know me, most of you in this room I think do, my name is 𝙄𝙣𝙩𝙚𝙚𝙤𝙚𝙤𝙤. I'm the director of CMS, the UBC Center for Migration Studies. And it's such a pleasure to welcome you to this third event in our Integration Reimagined speaker series. Integration Reimagined aims to foster alternative and critical perspectives on questions of quote unquote integration and belonging in contexts of immigration. And so thank you for joining us, both those of you in the room and those of you who are in the Zoom room. I'm going to just get some housekeeping out of the way. So if you're joining us online, we ask that you keep yourself muted throughout the talk. There'll be a Q&A session at the end of the talk, and you can also ask questions using the Q&A function on Zoom throughout the talk, though we'll only open up discussion after the presentation. For those of us in this room, if you need to use the washrooms, they're just straight through those doors, go to the back, to the elevators, turn right. There's also a gender inclusive washroom. And it's now my enormous pleasure to welcome our speaker today. Willem Schinkel is professor of social theory at Erasmus University, Rotterdam. And his work has had a really significant influence on the field of migration studies by fostering critical and interdisciplinary perspectives in the field. Professor Schinkel's work fundamentally challenges conventional paradigms of migration, of integration, terms like social cohesion. And he really pushes the boundaries of sociological research by including broader political and philosophical and ethical dimensions to these debates. His book, Imagine Societies, A Critique of Immigrant Integration in Western Europe, which was published by Cambridge in 2017, has certainly very much shaped my own thinking about integration. And I know this is also true for my students. And so I'm personally extremely excited to welcome Willem here with us, and I look forward to his talk, which is titled Migration as Debt. And please join me in welcoming Willem Schinkel.
Thank you very much. I'll try to share my screen in the meantime. Yeah, it's really a pleasure to be with you, even if it is digitally. I'd like to thank 𝙄𝙤𝙩𝙚𝙚 for the invitation, and also 𝙄𝙤𝙯 and Gabriella for the logistics. So far it's working out fine. If I turn dark all of a sudden, it could be because the lights are turned off. I'm in my office and it's evening in the Netherlands. So, and sometimes when you sit still for long enough, then the lights turn off because it's presumed that nobody's there. So I'll be frantically doing this, not to check if you're still listening, but just to turn the lights back on. So, it's a pleasure to talk to you about some of my recent work. And what I'll say really comes out of a collaboration with my friend and colleague 𝙄𝙣𝙩𝙚𝙬𝙤𝙬𝙤, and has gone through a couple of iterations, lectures at the University of Sussex, the University of Warsaw, and in Bristol. And some version of this will be published soon by the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies. But this is a story that I and we have been working on and will continue to work on because it's quite fundamental, actually, also for us. So the series that you invited me to speak for is called Integration Reimagined. And over the years, as part of my work on issues of migration and integration, I have come to believe that reimagining integration actually requires reimagining migration, which is too often treated as taken for granted. It's treated in commonsensical ways that really ultimately conform to state thought. So that's why I'm going to ask you a really fundamental question today. And so the question organizing my talk today is simply this. It's what is migration? And, you know, I realize that this is a ridiculously arrogant question to ask, especially in front of an audience of migration scholars. So I hope you bear with me. And also admit that the main context for me is the European one. Though I think that European colonialism and imperialism are the crucible in which migration entered in the or emerged in the first place. And just to start with an analogy that I find useful, if a natural scientist would conclude her explorations of what she finds in the various rooms that we are all in, by assuming that these rooms consist of tables and chairs, we would likely be disappointed for her not moving beyond common sense and prima facie appearances. And yet here we are as social scientists taking on board all kinds of commonsensical political and policy concepts such as nation state, border, migration, the economy, etc. So if I try to refrain from doing so, I realize that it might be somewhat of a provocation, but if we'd like the natural scientists to move beyond immediate appearances, then I think we need to do so as well. And it seems to me that there is an overwhelming taken for grantedness, implicitly or explicitly, that migration simply means people migrating, moving from one place, which is usually a nation state, to another. And in Euro-white contexts, migration is generally commonsensically regarded as what you could call a case of unfortunate travel. But whether the movement of a body gets to be migration is really not in the hands of that body. And so migration is not simply people moving from one place to another. One cannot therefore be a migrant. One can only be counted as a migrant, even by oneself, by the way. And then even many who don't move are counted as migrants, while many who do are not. So migration, as you well know, only really comes into view when it, well, indeed, when it comes into view. It occurs when people's mobility is captured by an official apparatus of registration. And, you know, this is an idea that sounds perhaps banal, but if we take it really seriously, I think we end up with a slightly different conception of migration than is common in migration studies. So one of the things that Rogier and I are arguing, and this is nothing new, is that Here too, the visualizing is the constitution of the thing that is visualized. So migration is the accounting according to which these and these bodies originally from this territory are now in that territory. And one needs an international system of nation states to make this plausible. And to make that sort of apparent in a first iteration, I think the analogy with birds is enlightening here. So representations of human migration and of bird migration often really look similar. Here are the birds and here are the migrants. And these kinds of maps, they are often flowcharts that have meteorological origins. This is the first historically known flow map, and it's by Edmund Halley. It's the map of the trade winds from 1686. But these maps were really made famous as depictions of invasions, such as Napoleon's invasion of Russia by Minard in 1812. And as you well know, pictures of migration very often still do look like pictures of invasions. And Ravensstein, Ernst Georg Ravensstein, was probably the first to apply flowcharts to migration. She did in 1885. But maps of migrating birds and humans are treated in entirely different ways, because the registration of birds and of humans is very different. So when birds are said to migrate, they do not go from a place of belonging to a place of non-belonging. Their migration is, you could say, the enactment of the extended topology that is simply their habitat. So wherever birds go, they belong. Admittedly, sometimes humans think otherwise. For instance, when the godwit is chosen as the archetypical Dutch national bird, because the point is that this Dutch bird migrates, and those frequenting the Netherlands spend half their time in Africa. So it's somewhat of a mystery to me why this is the archetypical Dutch bird. But then the Dutch have been known to exaggerate their place in the world. Now, it seems to me that this idea that where a body is, it simply is, makes perfect sense. Only once nation states are conjured up does it seem logical to assume that bodies can be in but not of a place, and that they not simply are where they are, but that there's something wrong with where they are, that they are not really there, that they belong elsewhere, and that they should move on or go back, or that they should first integrate before they have really arrived where they are already located. So in the migration of birds, the reference space is Earth. And in people, the reference space is the international system of nation states. Now, instead of treating migration as a particular modality of movement or mobility, Rogier and I see compelling reasons to attend to a distinct mode of power that is associated with the formation of migration as an epistemic and governmental concern. So I'm going to argue that even approaches to migration that consider it in terms of mobility, because that would work around certain political problems, in fact, in our conception, not quite accurate enough. Now, it's important, first of all, to note that migration accounting is an accounting that not only makes claims about the bodies of those it counts and the ones it doesn't count as migrants, It's not only about that migration accounting makes claims. It is always, and at the same time, a practice that gives an account of its own situatedness. Implicitly, certainly, the claim is always that it is from here, from this being in place, that those who come from there, those who are out of place, are counted. So we're dealing with a situation in which an apparatus of registration, often both governmental and scientific, we have to say, can successfully claim to register others as migrants. But it cannot verify that in other than tautological ways, referring back to its own registrations. And for us, it's really important to consider that it's the enactment of that situation as a whole that should be given consideration in anything called migration studies. So that means that what we call migration is a constellation of both the apparatus of registration and whatever it registers. And that constellation has a particular genealogy that is related both to a question of labor and to a question of empire. And currently, Rogier and I are working on a book that is supposed to be a genealogy or genealogies of migration. So what I talk about comes out of that larger project, or basically foreshadows that larger project that we have come to find is really necessary in order to understand what's going on when somebody says that is a migrant. So as a window on these two issues, the question of labor and the question of empire, I'd like to go back to one of the founders of the modern concept of migration, and that's Ernst Ravensthein. And I'd like to ask which inventions need to be enacted in order to be able to claim to have the facts of migration. In Ravensthein's case, even the laws of migration. And Ravensthein's key invention, I think, is to project a singular phenomenon, which he calls migration, beyond the empirical instances of his data. So what Ravensthein aims to demonstrate is the reality of an aggregated facticity above and beyond, or perhaps I should say underneath, the mess and multiplicity of very dissimilar data. And that reality, the reality of that aggregated facticity, he calls migration. And he does so by establishing that the parish records from which he draws his statistical analysis in Britain do not merely add up to an accidental aggregate of movements, but when graphed according to net flows between conjoined parishes, they are shaped, according to Ravensthein, according to recognizable patterns. And these patterns coincide with political economic processes such as industrialization and wage labor and marriage or household formation. And all of them are situated in the internal dynamics of empire, which is really the animating force of everything that Ravensthein describes. And these processes he describes as his famous currents of migration. So the crucial ascent of migration studies is here not the study of mobility, but the discovery of generalizable relocations that follow and feed labor's availability. So migration is a concern not for the mobility it assumes, but for the more or less predictable reorganization of settlement and its implications for labor that are its probabilistic outcome. 𝙍𝙗𝙗 really invents a wholly new vantage point from which to look at recordings of movements to thereby visualize migration. And he makes what you could call a really original step. He goes from data about certain movements, very dissimilar data also, to this singular thing that now gets to be seen as migration and that can be calculated and tabulated in terms of net flows. So only from that viewpoint does it begin to make sense to calculate these net flows, to add and subtract dislocations between bounded territories. And these dislocations can be added and subtracted because they are taken to be instances of one and the same social generality. So that operation returns to the scholar's eye, to 𝙍𝙗𝙗's eye, a definite pattern, law-like currents, he calls them, and that in turn affirms the idea that this adding and subtracting makes sense. So migration emerges as an object of attention and of problematization with a view to both the regulation of and its consequences for labor. It is discovered where labor, namely wage laborers and households, for instance, become spatially reordered. And it is here that borders, such as conjoined parishes in 𝙍𝙗𝙗's case, become at once sensory technologies and regulatory impositions. And it should not surprise that the first international standardizations of migration in the early 20th century came from the International Labor Office. So these were the first international attempts to standardize this thing called migration. So that's labor. But the birth of migration in Euro-wide context happens with respect to a transformation in the very question of labor populations. Migration emerges in the US when in 1820 the first official statistics are kept, and it becomes a problem only later in the 19th century in the wake primarily of Asians arriving there. In Europe, migration only really starts to become an issue with the demise of empire. European colonial settlers were not called or counted as migrants. And if current settlers are called migrants, for instance, in Canada, this issues from the same political historical source. The moment migrants first become a matter of concern is the moment colonial empire reaches its tipping point. That's when the possibility of movement in geo-racial space is reversed, when Euro-wide states, potentially or actually, become what is called receiving countries. And this dynamic of empire already structures 𝙍𝙗𝙗's work, in which the dynamic of the metropole, the imperial organizing center of all movement, is such that ultimately, and I quote 𝙍𝙗𝙗 here, he says, "The attractive force of one of our rapidly increasing cities makes its influence felt to the most remote corner of the empire." Because first, the people living near London move to London, and then people from farther away move to the places where these earlier people lived and moved to London. And ultimately, in the furthest reach of empire, people flock towards the center of empire, according to 𝙍𝙗𝙗. And that's actually something that he writes about in his book from 1876 called The Birthplaces of the People and the Laws of Migration. So this precedes his two famous articles from 1885 and 1889. Now, the crucial pivot is one that moves from forms of dispersal, from conquest and settler colonialism, to the possibility of forms of relocation, wherein populations cross colonial divides and global color lines, so that migrants become people observed as a concern in which race and labor are entangled. And it is these relocations that are found to be appropriate for the accounting techniques implied in the concept of migration. So at stake conceptually is how to bring two phenomena that, from an imperial point of view, refer to two completely different processes: immigration as the white settlement of colonized territories, and immigration as the transfer of laboring people. How to bring these two completely different processes within new practices of accounting that enact the comparability of immigration and immigration between national entities, and thereby imply the calculation of net flows. And that introduces the anxious possibility that white lives become comparable with those of non-white others, that they are to be counted as equal containers of potential value for the future. And migration attains this conceptual clarity here because it renders comparable and calculable what was previously qualitatively different, namely the relation between the European citizen and the colonial subject. So what we're dealing with is the introduction of a new question of coloniality and empire that carries the name migration. But once the world can become known as populated by migrants and natives, then the importance of governing the differential access to rights and citizenship of self-styled white nations takes on a new form. In other words, the concept formation of migration establishes, along with the practices of accounting themselves, the question of how a loss of the imperial distinction between immigration and immigration is to be managed. So, what is advocated as a universal kind of bird's eye view of migration is, I think, much better understood as the enactment of a new problematic of government, one that was already apparent in Ravenstein's experimentations with patterns of net flows. And the motivating question becomes, in all of this, what is gained and lost through migration? And more specifically, the question becomes, what do we, the natives, gain and lose through migration? Migration becomes a matter of national economic gains and losses of comparable and subtractable quantities. And one consequence of this perspective, if we, take this brief genealogy seriously, is that it really is an anachronism to speak of migration in the 10th or 15th century, just as it is an anachronism to say that Rembrandt van Rijn was an artist when that concept still had to be invented, and the infrastructures that would make it possible to differentiate artists from artisans did not yet exist. So just as in the way Rembrandt van Rijn was not an artist, there was no migration before the 19th century. This is what I'm arguing. So what's the organizing logic of this kind of administration of people and labor? I'm now getting into the final part of my talk, and here's the key point. From this administrative point of view, migration comes to diminish with each migrant counted a world in which migration didn't happen. This is what migration is. It's something that diminishes with each migrant counted a world in which migration didn't happen. And what 𝙄𝙣𝙩𝙚𝙬𝙤 and I argue is that if you look at the logic of defining, standardizing, accounting, and calculating migration, this is rock bottom. So migration is enacted through a kind of double accounting that sets off actual lives against the number of lives that would have been counted were migration not to have happened. So, you know, our definition of what a migrant is, that a migrant is someone who might not have been here. This is simply a migrant. It's not somebody that's been mobile. It's somebody counted in such a way that it becomes clear that it's a person who might not have been here. And here is the location from where the counting is done. So a first effect that this has is that while we know that we coexist here and now, we produce facts of this togetherness by archiving and keeping present an unrealized timeline in which migration didn't happen. You know, when it comes to migrants, we know that there is coexistence, but we at the same time act as if there isn't. Because we can only think about certain people with whom we coexist, the people we call migrants, in light of a horizon that's always present at the background in which they weren't here, in which migration didn't happen. And that unrealized timeline in which migration didn't happen is accounted for as the settled native population. That's the first effect of this idea that a migrant is someone who might not have been here in this double accounting. And a second effect is that these natives now have to live not only with themselves as natives, which was new to them, but as natives with the addition of those marked as migrants. So when people come to recognize themselves as natives, they recognize a coherence or purity that they immediately recognize as under threat, as something, the incursion upon which needs to be endured. So in the very way in which migration is born as a mode of accounting, it appears as something that requires certain sacrifices. It will cost something. Or in the language of economics, migration presents a native population with what economists call an opportunity cost. An opportunity cost is the benefits that would have accrued to the nation in the absence of migration. And those are benefits that now are missed out on. So it constitutes a deviation from the normalcy of a population simply keeping to itself, a kind of disappointing deviation from the counterfactual scenario of no migration, the costly refutation of a null hypothesis of a nation without migration. In other words, migration is a modality of debt. And this debt equals the costs incurred by the nation in the absence of the scenario no migration. So what migration does is to basically inscribed with each count, with each migrant counted, some outstanding debt to be settled, some opportunity cost or loss to be compensated. And while this loss is in fact the loss of a completely counterfactual situation, what we call the native scenario of no migration, the loss is very real in its consequences. So migration politics is then the history of controversies, of interventions and resolutions that all coalesce around the indebtedness of migrants and the management of the native demand to be satisfied. And what we argue is that any accounting of migration introduces a question of indebtedness. Even if nobody's talking explicitly about debt or costs or whatever, the very logic with which it becomes possible to say this is the native population and those are the ones added to it, the ones we call migrants, any calculation involves that question of indebtedness, even if it is implicitly. Because migration could only have been registered and verified and visualized through an administrative contrast between a world in which migration happened and one in which it did not happen, the world of the native scenario, so to speak. So migration requires an asymmetrical and continued attending to loss. And I want to end by briefly talking about two ways in which this plays out. It plays out in both a moral economy of migration and in a money economy. And perhaps, the most acute example of a moral economy of migration is the question of gratitude. And I'll give one example of that. In her study of Somali refugee settlement in Maine, Catherine Vestiman describes precisely this politics of gratitude. She writes, and I quote, a common question from the audience at public presentations offered by Somalis to explain their history is, are you grateful to be here? And people have suggested to me that Somalis should publish thank you letters in the local newspapers to let other Lewiston residents know how grateful they are. That's an example from the US, but it really ties into the emergence of all kinds of notions of earned citizenship and of the need for integration and enculturation programs. What these things make visible is not only that coexistence, living together, is something to be earned, which means to repair some loss at the side of a native public. But it also shows that the performance of effort on the side of migrants, for instance, by completing an enculturation or a language course, is significant precisely because it indicates a recognition of and a submission to this relationality of debt. So this is why critiques of enculturation or integration programs as assimilationist, while not necessarily wrong, tend perhaps to fall short not only in assuming that assimilation occurs between two distinct entities that pre-exist the call to assimilate, but such critiques also fail to recognize that the performance is what counts. Central is the effort that the migrants need to be seen to make. And the effort is an equivalent to the payment of a debt, an investment that the migrant needs to be seen to make, making up for the imposition that the migrant is considered to be in the economy of migration. So These are some examples that illustrate how this indebtedness plays out in terms of a moral economy. But migration as debt is also at play as a, quite literally, a money economy, although we'll see that the two are intricately connected. The cost of migration is widely present in research programs and controversies over the fiscal sustainability of public spending and the distributive effects on households and enterprises. And attempts to perform such calculations turn out to be very complex, as the costs of migrant accommodation must not only be diminished by any realized benefits of their availability, they must also be offset against a cost-benefit analysis in which migration had never taken place. And this is what economists literally do. They typically try to capitalize on what they call natural experiments. So they seek out a chance event against which to offset the native scenario, no migration, against the sudden influx of migrant workers. Famously, for instance, they did so after the 1980 Mariel boat lift and the sudden influx of Cuban migrants in the US. So, in the ways that economists measure the costs of migration, we see that reference to any fact about migration's cost must be made by offsetting measurable effects against the non-occurrence of migration. This is literally what economists do. Now, interestingly, perhaps or not, much calculative work that economists do on the economic effects of migration tends to find a net benefit. But what I'm interested in here is to scrutinize really what makes such a conclusion possible in the first place. Benefits or costs, these conclusions are only calculable against a horizon of migration's erasure of the hypothesis that it did not take place. Calculating benefits or costs of migration means performing the parallel scenario in which certain people that are now present are in fact imagined as absent. And the imaginative capacity required for this is the accounting of migration. Now, there's also another discourse in the economics of migration. Posner and Weil propose that poorer citizens of wealthy countries get the opportunity to rent migrants so as to assure these citizens consent to a global project of alleviating poverty, and in the process to provide them with benefits in the form of a new system of indentured labor. These two economists themselves, in fact, speak of a caste system. I'm not kidding. So in this scheme, migrants' rights would be actively and explicitly curtailed so as to continue to signify white superiority in the system of what is framed with very humanitarian rhetoric as patronage. And the work of former World Bank chief economist Branko Milanovic similarly entails the actual settling of accounts by way of proposals for differential wages between natives and migrants. So he's going beyond calls for a hostile environment and a sober reception regime. Milanovic envisages the actual setting of asymmetric rights and wages. More than that, his main concern is with the poorest people in the richest countries, whom he considers the real losers of globalization, since, relatively speaking, according to him, migrants have a much higher income increase to win. So curtailing rights and wages of migrants would, I quote Milanovic now, would assuage the concerns of the native population while still ensuring the migrants are better off than they would be had they stayed in their own countries. And I think that this quelling of white rage is a key element of the economy of migration. Implied also in Posner and Weil's proposal is that it both accommodates and prevents white rage over migration by turning the presence of migrants into directly commodifiable availability in the form of labor, and by adding direct economic benefits plus the psychological wage, as W.B. Du Bois said, of a white patronage that can observe itself as humanitarian compassion. So the calculative labor of such economists shows that the moral economy and the money economy of migration are really very much entangled. Milanovic, for instance, recognizes a very slim effect of migration on wages, but then he continues to balance in one and the same accounting maneuver economic factors and what he calls the preservation of cultural norms. And one option that Milanovic offers is to make immigrants pay higher taxes. As Gurminda Bamra concludes about this, she says, I quote, "Notice that the world's poorest are asked to pay taxation to support those within the 75th to 90th percentile." But I think that this becomes understandable, though not approvable, obviously, but it becomes understandable once we recognize the logic of debt that organizes migration as an economy. Migration simply is this way of settling accounts. Whatever practical or political conclusions one draws from that, the very possibility of saying this is a migrant and this not requires this kind of accounting, this double accounting, in which migrants are treated as those people who might not have been here, which is obviously something that goes for all people, but tends not to be applied to all people. Now, as a final example of the entanglement of the moral economy and the money economy, consider political sociologist Wolfgang Streeck's, the German political sociologist Wolfgang Streeck's take on immigration policy, which indeed literally deals with the question, as he says, how are facts construed to fit, justify, and make appear possible moral or economic practices, or economic practices defended as moral ones. So he's very consciously explicit about the entanglement of morality and money here. So in Streeck's analysis, things that he calls cultural fragmentation, segregation, and conflicts between altruists and egoists all add up on the credit side of the moral account. And on the debit side, they are balanced only by what he calls the, I quote, opportunity in an age of economism and technocracy to demonstrate unconditional compassion. So this is the only possible good side of migration. It provides a possibility to demonstrate unconditional compassion, according to Streeck. As Streeck says, even economists underscore the importance of morality in these matters. He says, even economists, given to cost-benefit analysis, warn against completely ending resettlement, as this might allow voters to forget about faraway misery, making it politically more difficult for governments to support victims of war and starvation abroad. So they therefore recommend, he says, admitting a limited number of families for a heartbreaking and mind-softening illustration of distress and for a direct experience of gratefulness. Now, this gratefulness can then be considered as intricately bound up with the conventional economic cost-benefit analysis. So I would say against this, that this idea of even economists, that of course economists say this because migration is an economy. And immediately preceding this even economists in 𝙗𝙩𝙦 is indeed the accounting done in the realm of the money economy, where he says costs do matter, even and precisely in rich countries, and they easily turn into a political issue. Under optimistic assumptions, the fiscal costs of integration may be recovered at a later time once immigrants have jobs and pay taxes. The question is over how long this takes. Upfront, the investment must in any case be significant and certainly higher than the fiscal costs per capita of unemployed citizens. This can give rise to popular resentment, especially if integration takes longer than promised and balanced budget policies cause competition for scarce resources between immigrants and the local population, for example, in housing. And I highlight this argument by 𝙗𝙦𝙦 here because it is a common trope, really, in liberal discourse as such. The idea is that too much migration will cause native resentment animated by a presumed mixture of racism and anxiety over competition concerning housing, or more frequently mentioned, labor. So in this very common line of argument, white rage is mobilized as a cost of migration. And the amount of migrants admitted is to be calibrated with a view to keeping this rage in check. So the cost of migration is quite literally translated into a resentment conveniently attributed to the phantom of a white working class. And this equivocation of migration with the cost of white rage over labor competition, I think, is liberalism's most subtle mixture of morality and money in the economy of migration. It is part of liberalism's contemporary dance with fascism. And the most rudimentary fact that's enacted in all of these accounts of migration as debt is the knowledge that migrants are people who might not have been here. Any data point entered into the administrative infrastructures of migration's accounting begins to, at the very least, configure a national democracy, a national demography in which migration didn't have to happen. Migration towards the metropoles of colonial rule can then begin to be envisioned as the arrival of people that we, the natives, need not have taken into account if they hadn't crossed our borders, if we hadn't been either morally magnanimous or outright naive, pick your politics here, to allow them entry. In principally becoming an additive act, one more person is now among us, migration accounts for the loss of a counterfactual world in which that person didn't have to be taken into account. And it allows the person among us to be marked as an accident, a case of unfortunate travel, among us, yet not yet arrived, among us, but not of us. And this is why migrants can be said to have a duty to integrate, why one can speak of the costs of migration for society, and why society can only bear so much migration. As a thing to bear, then, migration is a modality of debt. And this debt is paid with every displacement by gentrification, every fall into poverty by job discrimination, every demand to integrate, every racialized asymmetry in education systems. All of these are reparations for the thing that is registered as migration, for the account and the interpellation, hey you, migrant. And this becomes perhaps most visible in the case of those explicitly called economic migrants, but the genealogy of migration I've briefly sketched here means that coding some migrants as economic should not blind us to the logic of the economy of migration as such, the logic of debt that's at play in all instances of migration. And I want to end by simply asking, or putting forward my question to scholars of migration, which is simply this: why should we be invested in that logic of debt? Why not explore the many ways in which coexistence might be done otherwise with less violence? And, I hope that today I've given some impetus to redirecting us towards these questions. So I'll stop here and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Willem, for that really provocative and rich talk. And I look forward to our conversation now. Let me just get my instructions here correct. So we're going to take turns between questions from the room here, the actual room, and then the Zoom room. For those of you who are on Zoom, please use either the Q&A function or raise your hand to ask a question. And Gabrielle is going to manage those of you on Zoom. And those of you who are on Zoom, you can also upvote questions that you also find interesting by using that button. So that moves them higher up in the priority line of being answered. And yeah, I think that's all I need to tell you all. So we're going to start with the room. I'll start us off and then I'll hand over to all of you. So I think, Willem, that the notion of migration as that, the logic of that is a really powerful one, and certainly made me think about all sorts of things related to that. And when you talked about Wolfgang Streeck in terms of this question, how long do you need to pay off the debt? That prompted for me the question, can you ever pay off the debt? And should we think of that debt as something that's intergenerational, that gets passed down the generations as migrants become ethnic minorities, but the debt remains and gets passed down? So I'm really curious to hear you thinking of that. And yeah.
Yeah, I think, thank you. That's an excellent question. And it's a question, in fact, that, many people who are said to be of migrant background, as is common parlance now in many European countries, at least, they ask that. Sometimes they ask that to me, what do I have to do in order to no longer be a migrant? And obviously, there's a very paradoxical thing going on when people are said to be second-generation migrants or third-generation migrants. I sometimes say, well, there are nth generation migrants, and that is a way of projecting forward into the future, the possibility of having people identifiable as an added burden on those who can see themselves as natives. And so, in a way, being a migrant has similarities to, to being a murderer. If you have once murdered somebody, you are forever a murderer, right? Whereas if you have shoplifted when you were younger, some people here might have done that, then you will not remain a shoplifter until you die. But there are some identities you do not lose, and migrant, I think, is one of them. That's not to say that is some apodictic statement that will forever be the case, because in the genealogy of migration we see that there are these paradigmatic moments in which things could get completely overturned, and they have to do with the dynamics of empire and labor. So I'm not saying that there will be fifth and sixth and seventh generation migrants, but in the current configuration, with the current historical position vis-a-vis the post-colonial states from which many migrants are said to come, that is certainly what we see happening. So, you know, there are these paradoxical figures of second and third migration, generation migrants. These are migrants that never migrated, but yet they are migrants. So this shows you really that whether you're a migrant or not doesn't really have anything to do with your mobility. It's really about being counted and labeled and classified as a migrant.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so in the room, if you can also just raise your hand. I'm going to keep a list of folks who raised their hands who would like to suggest it. Yes, and please tell us your name and your institutional home.
Thank you so much for this insightful. Okay, better now. Hello, I'm Abu. So thank you so much for this really impressive, insightful presentation. My question actually starts from the one of the conclusions you made, but then I'm going to return back to your the first half of the presentation. So moving away from the logic of that, and then just seeing the how migration studies, migration inquiry is a study of generalizable population, right? During the first half of presentation, I was so much like Martina Tazzioli and her work, The Making of Migration, was always like on my mind. Thinking that she also like makes somehow the same argument, though like you go to different directions, like you're more into the moral and fiscal economy of migration. And that is like how migrants are governed as individuals and as a groups, right? It's a kind of weird question, but I wanted to know like what kind of conversation you can have like with Martina Tazzioli and the way she sees like the making of migration subjects or object of governance, identification, and other like processes. And is there any like further methodological and conceptual insights there? I hope it's not a weird question.
No, thank you. No, it's not at all a weird question. And so I don't have the details of her work readily at hand, but her work is definitely important for ours, as is the work of many others, by the way. But so I think we are generally very much in line with her work. I think there's two additions that we'd like to make. I think there's hardly anything that we'd like to refute or take issue with. Perhaps a certain reliance still on mobility. That is something that we try to move away from, and that is something that's very present explicitly or latently in much of also of critical migration studies and critical border studies. But I think the two things that we we would add is this this SDS kind of attention to the kinds of inventions that are necessary statistically in order to speak of migration. So that has to do with what 𝙍𝙩𝙩𝙚𝙤𝙀 is doing, crafting an object that is more than a mere aggregate, but it's its own thing. It becomes a thing sui generis. And the second thing is that, when we scrutinize the logic of that, we see that as accounting, which is literally an accounting practice, and there's all kinds of people in governmental offices, but then also in universities, sadly, from our point of view, actually, in migration studies, doing that accounting. But when we take accounting seriously, that's not an innocent practice. That's an oikonomia, and in fact, as Caitlin Rosenthal has shown in Accounting for Slavery, much of the critical inventions of accounting come from the plantations. And we see a kind of parallel there. It's not a literal parallel, obviously, but we see that this accounting is not a neutral thing. But I think that this would be something that the work of Martina Dazioli, would be very much in line with. And really, the only thing that where we differ is this idea of mobility. Just to add on that, I think one of the things where we also differ from many existing analyses of migration, whether they're critical or not, is that they implicitly, or much more often explicitly, rely on not only some form of mobility, but also mobility towards some sphere of inclusion, right? Some form of some sphere of inclusion in which that inclusion can be withheld in various degrees. And so these become critiques of exclusion. But I think, and this is also one of the things that I've written about before in that 2017 book also, these critiques of exclusion really reify conceptions of inclusion that entail the tacit assumption, at least, that the racialized violence of bordering is in fact fundamentally extraneous to liberal universality, right? That is a mere contradiction waiting to be rectified with the help of critique, of the critique of exclusion. So, much critical work in migration and border studies then ends up pointing out the inconsistencies or hypocrisies, perhaps. It's very often that the hypocrisies of liberal state systems that preach justice, but then still enact violence and exclusion. And I think then very often that the central, the animating drive or the central motif of such work becomes sort of clarifying the justified and effective means of inclusion, right? As that promises to return consistency to liberal claims of universal human rights. But, I think that the consistency of that move rests on an investment, a very political investment in these liberal state systems. So, in such approaches, the power of exposition and critical debate is hoped to kind of set in motion some form of what you could call liberal self-correction. And the assumption there is that liberalism fundamentally is okay. It's just that there are hypocrisies, contradictions waiting to be resolved. So and that also is something that we do find very prevalent also and precisely in critical border studies or critical migration studies, or in what is sometimes called reflexive migration studies, and even in decolonial approaches. And that's something that we try to, problematize at least and try to stay away from. So there are some points where we would have a discussion, but it's all in with a lot of sympathy for the kind of work that you mentioned, in fact.
Amanda.
Hi, Willem. My name's Amanda Chung, and I'm an assistant professor in the sociology department here at UPC. Thank you so much for this really amazing and thought-provoking thought. These ideas are really helping me to make some sense of some challenges that I'm finding in my own writing right now, which is dealing with unsettling and questioning who we can say is part of a nation and who is part of the diaspora, and questioning who really counts as a migrant when we take into account the fictive nature of colonial and post-colonial borders. So I'm really excited to go and read more of your work after this talk and to cite it in my writing. I really appreciate in this talk the very central role of official apparatuses of registration in determining who counts as a migrant and who does not. And I was wondering if you could talk more about how undocumented migrants and asylum seekers and other forms of irregular migration fit into this picture. So people who are outside of these official apparatuses of registration, sometimes by accident, but then often by design as well. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's a really good question, because I think, if it allows me to clarify, perhaps, if I'm able to do it, but it allows me to clarify this very idea of who's in official statistics and who isn't, and what are official statistics. If you study not only the history but also contemporary practices of statisticians of migration and of attempts to standardize migration, you will find very intricate discussions by very frustrated people. So, because if you're trying to standardize migration, that's just impossible, and it's recognized as impossible. There always comes a point where these statisticians ultimately simply say, well, okay, let's just make some decisions here. We're simply going to call it this, and because they know that they're dealing with things that are shifting on so many planes that it's next to impossible to to actually be able to claim to have the real verifiable knowledge. And so a couple of things are frustrating there. One of the things is that obviously not everybody is registered, but then they can work around that by working with samples, by using all kinds of statistical tools. And even those who are counted, there are statistical operations. There goes my light. Sorry about that. There are statistical operations performed also on those counted. And a second thing that these statisticians really fret over is the ever-increasing number of categories. So, from expats to asylum seekers, refugees, temporary migrants, etc., etc. This is one of the things that they really worry about. And ultimately, I think that is, for at least for me and Rogier, that is their problem. For us, it's simply interesting to note that the logic of what they're trying to do ultimately comes down to this idea of a native scenario, and then some people added on. Whether they succeed in successfully circumscribing what the exact categories are in which those people fall, and whether they succeed in actually accurately counting them, for us is in fact a secondary concern. That's really their concern, and we note that they are very frustrated, but that's not to our frustration. So I think the ultimate answer to your question is, well, while there may be a distinction for, within the accounting of migration between the official and the unofficial, in fact, from the point of view that we have, looking at this genealogy of migration, it's all the same. and it doesn't fundamentally differ, and it doesn't also fundamentally differ, even though it differs sort of quantitatively even in practice. We know that those without documents, can be exploited even further, even more. So there are all kinds of differences there, certainly, but fundamentally, this relation of debt is still there, is paid differently, and it's enacted asymmetrically, and so this is in fact one of the points that people like Nicholas de Genova make, that is that, according to him, there's this border spectacle, and it's all ultimately related to regulating the price of labor. And for us, that's going on, but it's just one part of the entire story, because even if that were not to exist, we would still there would still be this logic of debt, even though it works in different ways. So yeah, I hope that's somewhat coherent an answer to your question.
All right. This is Gabrielle. I'm turning on for a second. I'm going to offer a question now from the Q&A. Naomi has written in, could it be argued that migration is a reformed version of extractive colonialism as a form of ongoing extraction from predominantly racialized bodies?
Well, so yeah, thanks very much for that question. So I think on the one hand, definitely that is true, but it might also be it might also be saying too little, because if we tend to the genealogy of migration, there is a reason that migration was not an issue under colonialism, but is now. And it is certainly, you could certainly say, well, so it's colonialism under different circumstances. And in a way that is true. But I think on the one hand, the sort of reverse territorial relation is really important. And it's important not to probably think about colonialism in a way that's too disconnected from the specifics of the question of land. So there's a difference there. And there's also a difference in the sense that with migration, you get a really new relation between what was formerly the colonizer and the colonized. You get, this is precisely the novelty that migration brings. It becomes possible to account for both in the same accounting process, but asymmetrically so. And the asymmetry can certainly be seen as a form of extraction. But to capture the entire logic of the situation, it would be, I think, slightly reductive to only look at one side of the account. When we think about this in terms of a configuration or a constellation of an apparatus of registration and accounting and of people, I think both sides are really crucial. And there's perhaps a danger of forgetting precisely that relationality and the specifics of that, also the historical specifics of that relationality, when we simply say, well, it's extractive colonialism redux, or but these are first thoughts. So I think it's actually a really good and important question that I would typically like to think about longer, and I will. So thank you for proposing it.
Thanks for that answer. We'll go back to questions in the room now.
Okay, I'm Alice.
Hi, Professor Schinkel. Thank you very much for this thought-provoking presentation. I really enjoyed it. My name is 𝙄𝙣𝙩𝙚𝙚𝙤𝙚, and I'm a PhD student at UBC Educational Studies, and my research is around internationalization of higher education. And when I'm listening to your lecture, I was thinking, oh, this is definitely a conceptual framework that I am going to utilize in terms of looking at how international students in Canada, they are facing the exclusion and discrimination, as well as they are considered as labor market. And not sure if you are aware that recently in Canada, the Immigration Canada, they actually launched a new policy regarding international students because they are considered as competitors for the rising cost of housing. So lately they are having a new policy to introduce a cap for international student permits, so that it will show a decrease of 35% of international students in 2024 compared to 2023. One of the reasons is that because just that, as I mentioned, is that because they are because of the resentment towards international students, because they are considered as the reason for the housing, unaffordable housing for local people, I would say. So I think the topic and the conceptual here is really useful for me to think about this controversial thing. And my question here is that I'm curious about to know this particular population, international students in Europe, like how are you aware of anything similar, or what are the policies in Europe regarding international students and how it is related to migration and policy and governance? That's all. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much for that question that I really recognize and resonate with. First of all, I coordinate a master's program here in Rotterdam that's called Engaging Public Issues. And just last week, I admitted a Canadian student for next year. So, this might be a reason that housing is expensive, even though it is here as well. But I think, the issue you raise is exactly the same, in fact, here. A couple of years ago, or maybe it was only last year, Dutch Parliament asked the Minister of Education to, to think of ways to cut the number of English language programs in Dutch universities. And that Minister of Education happened to be Robert Dijkgraaf, who was, prior to becoming Minister of Education, was the head of Princeton's Institute for Advanced Study. He's a famous physicist. So he is an academic animal. So he sent Parliament an interesting report that if you work at a university, you saw that he meant no changes whatsoever. But since then, we've had elections, and the biggest party now is the fascist party PVV, the party, the Freedom Party, as it's called, but it's a very selective freedom. And so this new parliament has just asked the minister to ask the universities to let Parliament know within 8 weeks what they're going to do to cut the number of English language programs. So we're actually right in the middle of this. And it has to do with a lot of things. In fact, housing, while that's really an issue currently, is not one of the main reasons that are mentioned. You know, in Dutch Parliament, it's really all about, you know, the Dutch citizens supposedly having to pay only for Dutch students, for Dutch language programs, regardless of who's actually paying. So here, very similarly, international students are seen as an add-on to the, you know, native students. And I think if we zoom out, and if we, and the same goes for the economy of migration, if we zoom out, underlying all of this is something that's very fundamental to economists, obviously, which is the idea that there is natural scarcity, right? That scarcity ultimately is what animates everything. And I think this is one thing that we need to resist, because it only becomes you know, scarcity only becomes plausible once you have in place all of these artificial boundaries that we call nation states, etc. Because there is no natural scarcity, obviously. Like oil only becomes scarce once you have an economy that's hooked to oil. You know, coal are scarce once you you know, have an economy that's run on oil. So scarcity presupposes a system of valuation, but it is not a system of valuation. And the same goes with all of the scarcity logics that go on in universities and in our societies today. These neoliberal logics really need to be resisted. So, you know, thinking with the kind of, you know, logic that I've been talking about today means that perhaps one effective way to counter these xenophobic and racist discourses is actually to target the heart, which is the presumption of scarcity. Because once that needs to be defended, it becomes clear that that scarcity can only exist under the acceptance of a number of things that need in the first instance to be politicized and not simply taken for granted. And one of these things certainly is the very idea of a bounded nation state.
Kia ora. My name is Alice Te Punga Samuel. I'm here in a split appointment between English and critical Indigenous studies. I'm a Māori scholar and I have an interest in Indigenous migration, including the migration of my own community. I was buying what you were selling in terms of your argument, but I have a question about that. You know, the thing that kept popping up for me was every time you use the word native. And I can appreciate that for you, maybe in Europe, you mean a little N native, but when you're sitting in a place like Canada or when I'm home in New Zealand, there's big N natives as well. And so I wonder about the risks of using a frame that doesn't also trouble this kind of assumption of a base home, native, local, whatever configuration. I can appreciate that you're suggesting that that itself is a kind of fabrication, but it's a fabrication that has very particular meaning and consequences in a place like Canada or New Zealand, right? And so I wonder about the risk of setting up a kind of relation between the migrant and the native and this concept of the native. There's a risk that can actually you know, just overwrite once again capital N natives in whichever place. And I guess to kind of leap in with a suggestion of where maybe the conversation can go, I was really struck by the discourse of gratitude. And of course, Indigenous people, we are always asked by our settler occupying states to be grateful for colonialism, right? And I wonder about whether that's the same kind of gratitude that the migrant is meant to offer to the state, or whether it's a different kind of gratitude. Is there a value in thinking about them being kind of entangled? Obviously, the gratitude in these kind of colonial states is maybe a bit different than in Europe, eh? Or is it? I don't know. Is there a risk that if we get these two kinds of gratitude, thanks for having me and thanks for being here, is there a risk that if we
if we over entangle those two, we lose something? Or is there a possibility that these two kind of requirements of gratitude provides us with a way to do what I hear you wanting to do, which I'm also interested in doing, which is to destabilize and denaturalize the state system itself, which is issuing this requirement.
Yeah. So thanks very much for that question. I mean, that's a fantastic question that gets to the heart of this analysis, and also it shows that this is the next chapter we need to pay attention to. I've told a story that very much works from the history of European notions and accountings of migration, and then the native gets a certain meaning. But I absolutely appreciate that sounds completely different from the perspective of a settler colonial state, and especially from a native perspective within such a state. So I would say this is one area where we need to do more work and think harder and learn more from people who've written about this. I know, I mean, there's actually contentious differences within critical migration studies on this also, and in fact there is a genealogy to the very notion of the native, obviously, as well as entangled with colonialism, because it in a way it's hard to argue that a thing or person called native can exist prior to colonialism. That happens in an encounter, only then does one become a native. But at the same time, I recognize, I do appreciate the effort to think about the similarity in the logic there, and I think that there is a similarity, and it's that if we were to name ultimately what's similar there is the workings of whiteness in one form or other, and that works through a long history of notions of progress and development, and especially of improvement. And so, as you know probably very well, notions of improvement were central to European colonial projects. They were not the only legitimations used, and certainly not the only ones used in New Zealand and Australia. But they were always present, and they're often traced to one of the fathers of liberal political theory, John Locke. But in fact, you can find notions of improvement already in the 14th century thinker John of Paris. So there's a long history of thinking about not only land but also labor in terms of improvements. So not only the idea that labor improves the land, but also that the labor is also to be improved. When the English colonized Ireland, this logic of improvement was very literally and explicitly applied to both the land and the people. So you get this idea that colonialism in fact means a form of improvement for which gratitude is due. And so I think ultimately you end up with a very similar situation in which whiteness demands gratitude for what it claims to be development or progress or improvement. But at the same time, I think it's important to attend to the specifics of how you get to that similar point through very different trajectories. I take your question about the meaning of the native as an indication that that's precisely the kind of work that we need to focus more on now. So yeah, thank you for that.
Okay, we've got time for one more question. Ganz okay.
Hello, thank you very much for this very insightful talk. I'm 𝙍𝙩𝙚𝙦𝙚𝙦𝙚𝙤𝙧. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at McGill University Faculty of Law. And I wanted to ask you about the role of law and role of state policies in general in shaping these categorizations within the genealogy that you mentioned. What I mean is differences between different categories of migrants are not necessarily always natural distinctions, but they are very much constructed, legally constructed. Migranthood, in fact, can be a very much legally constructed concept. To just give, very short examples, for instance, how refugees from Ukraine or refugees from Syria were treated under different policy frameworks within Europe in terms of access to services or access to labor market could be an example, or how asylum seekers are handled within the Canadian policies, how they are given access to labor market instantly, and then which makes them a bit, in some sense, absolved in the temporary migrants scheme, could be another example. Or in Europe, in the nation state building efforts, a lot of who would be today refugees were directly, they became citizens depending on their ethnic descent. So in this sense, gratitude component changes, expectations in this regard changes, the depth dimension changes, I think, a lot. People with similar backgrounds may fit different public policies in different times and in different host countries. So coming back to my question, I just wanted to ask you, if possible, to talk a bit more about states' active interference in this dynamic of depth and how it is shaped. Thank you.
Thank you. That's an excellent question. I mean, yeah, I completely agree with what you're saying. Especially the example that you give of Ukrainians and Syrians really speaks to recent memory also here in Europe. And I think the way to understand that is to understand this in terms of the proximity to whiteness. And so proximity to whiteness comes with a greater or lesser degree of deservingness. And so I think those Syrians admitted here are in fact, from them, a greater demand of gratitude is in fact issued, precisely because they are seen to be at a greater distance from whiteness, which in the case of Ukraine is really interesting, because 10 years ago, Ukrainians certainly did not count as white in most of Europe. In my own country, there was even a referendum, and it was decided that Ukraine could not or should not be able to apply for membership of the European Union. And all of that changed, obviously, with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And then sort of it became clear, oh, now Ukrainians are in fact white, or they are in proximity to whiteness. So I think that you're absolutely right in underscoring that, yeah, hard legal categories were applied, but these hard legal categories, what lies underneath them? Underneath them lie the much more flexible and historically contingent and shifting boundaries of whiteness. And I think, in particular, the Ukrainians, they paid what James Baldwin called the price of the ticket of whiteness, when they tortured African students who were trying to cross the border from the Ukraine to Poland. That was their way of showing that they know what it takes to be white, right? It means to participate in anti-blackness in this case. Same in the same way that people like Rudiger have talked about you know, the situation in the US for Italians, for Irish migrants, etc. And so I think that deservingness and the degree to which gratitude are demanded, yes, they are enshrined in legal categories, but underneath the legal categories is always something else. And in fact, I was when you were saying, I was thinking of a quote by 𝙍𝙩𝙩𝙗, which I have here. So it's a small quote, and it's 𝙍𝙩𝙗 reacting to criticisms that he got from his colleagues at the Royal Statistical Society when he presented his first paper in 1885. So 𝙍𝙩𝙗 is then saying, literally, I quote, "Of course, I am perfectly aware that our laws of population and economic laws generally have not the rigidity of physical laws, as they are continuously being interfered with by human agency. Currents of migration," he says, "which would flow naturally in a certain direction traced out for them in the main by geographical features may thus be diverted or stopped altogether by legislative enactments." So 𝙍𝙗𝙗 is very aware that in fact there's not this natural phenomenon at all. There's legislative enactments, but basically what 𝙍𝙗𝙗 is doing, yeah, but I'm treating it as law-like in this double sense anyhow, you know. So he's on the one hand recognizing that these are legal categories, but he's saying, yeah, but above and beyond that, there's actual patterns here. And, you know, I think if we take that, you know, seriously, what we have to understand is that it becomes possible to have your cake and eat it too, in that sense, once we understand the racial logics and the colonial logics that underpin this. So, and in this case, I think proximity to whiteness is precisely the thing that explains the very different situations that Ukrainians and Syrians, for instance, are in. I'll end on a brief anecdote, which is that, you know, when the first Ukrainians came to the Netherlands, somebody I know was talking to universities saying, you know, we should provide these recent refugees with the opportunity to come and study at the university with no cost. And the university said, yeah, sure, bring them. And then this person brought a bunch of Syrian refugees. And you should have seen the look on the face of the university administrators as they realized that they'd said, yes, bring these refugees, but they hadn't specified that they only wanted to see the white ones, you know. So that was just a moment where it becomes immediately clear that, yeah, there are these legal distinctions and they really do matter. But what animates the law is still a logic of whiteness, you know, of whiteness as property, even as Harris has said, you know. So.
Well, Willem, thank you so very much for your talk, helping us, you know, denaturalize migration and thinking of it as a modality of debt, which I think is a really fruitful way to move forward. And thanks for the engagement with all the questions. And we look forward to your book. And I know we'll be continuing the conversation here among us. There are some other folks I want to thank for this event. Admasa Chepetai in the back here, Atri Bhattacharjee, Gabriel Dumplings-Williver, and Tori Yang. Without them, this event would not have happened. And it's been such a smooth event. We haven't done much hybrid programming. We've really tried to do things in person. So this was kind of a trial run getting back into pandemic times. And thank you so much for making this just beautiful event. And we look forward to the food we're about to eat and enjoy here. I want to thank, of course, all of you who took time out of your day to come, both of you in this room, those of you who are online. Again, without you, would have been no point having this event. So yeah, I look forward to continuing to talk about what we've just learned about. And let me not forget to also announce the final talk in the speaker series, which will take place on March 11th in this room. we are in this actual room. So we're excited to welcome here Miriam Tickton, who's professor of anthropology at the City University of New York. And in general, for more information about upcoming CMS events, you can always visit the Center for Migration Studies website, subscribe to our mailing list to be informed of everything that's going on here.